All right, hello YouTube, this is Anatomy Blitz, and in today's video we're going to talk about the movements of your lower extremity. So to start off with, we're going to be talking about hip flexion and extension, hip adduction and abduction, hip internal and external rotation, knee flexion and extension, dorsiflexion and plantarflexion, and then inversion and eversion. So to start off with, let's talk about hip flexion. So in all of these, I decided it's probably going to be easier for you to see if I do it 3 different ways. So here's your baseline person. You see straight legs, straight hips, all that stuff. This is him performing the movement that I'm talking about. And this is with the anatomical midline going down him. So to start off with, the hip flexion is pushing your hip forwards. So as you can kind of see right here, his hips are lifting up and they're raised and they're kind of making that swooping motion. So think of when you're kicking a ball. If you keep your legs straight and you're kicking a ball, your hips are moving upwards, kind of in that motion. So I drew a little soccer ball to indicate that your hips are moving up, kind of like the same motion when you kick the ball. When we go over to the midline, we can see when we have the midline where your hips are in relation to where they normally would be in the midline. So here, this hip is straight down, but this one is up more, right? It's pushing out, it's moving forward. Hip flexion, your hip is moving up, it is being flexed. Next up is your hip extension, which pulls your hip backwards. So this is your baseline guy again. Here, this time, is when you pull your leg back and you cock your leg back and ready to kick the soccer ball. Here, you see how it's starting to move behind the midline, right? Here's your midline. Your leg is moving back behind the midline, so it's hip extension. So hip flexion is moving it forward through past the midline. Hip extension is moving it back behind the midline. The other motions that your hip do are abduction and adduction. So to start off with this abduction with a B, which is away from the midline. So hip abduction is moving your hip away from the midline. So here's your baseline guy. This is kind of what it looks like when you're performing the motion. Imagine this is the anatomical midline going down your body. You can see kind of the motion. He's sticking his hip out and he's moving it away from the midline, right? You're standing still and then you move your leg to outwards kind of. That is hip abduction. You're moving your hip away from the midline. You kind of see that motion away from the midline. Next up is hip adduction. Now, hip ab and adduction sound very similar. One has a B and one has a D. I remember this by hip adduction, hip adduction. It has the word add in it, so add into the midline. Because hip adduction, I'm going to refer to it as adduction because it's easier to hear rather than the B and the D sound similar. So hip adduction is moving the hip towards the midline. You're adding it to the midline. So here's your baseline model. Right here, you can kind of see how it goes and your hip crosses the midline. Whoops. Your hip crosses the midline. You're moving your hip over the other leg. So now here's your midline. Your hip is moving it on top of your other leg. You're moving your hip across the midline towards the midline. You're adding to the midline, right? Abduction, you're moving away from the midline. Adduction, you're moving to the midline. The other motions that your hip do is internal and external rotation. So to start off with is your internal rotation here. Here's your baseline guy. And here is actually, my bad, external rotation. I don't know why I have that there. Pretend I don't. Hip external rotation. So here's your baseline guy, right? Your hips are externally rotated. So this would be kind of almost like when you're sitting cross-legged, which I have right there. Your hips are outwards and your knees are inward, right? So your hip is moving out, your leg is pointed in. Hip pointed out, leg pointed in, right? With the midline, you see it here. Your thighs are pointed out, leg pointed in, thighs pointed out, leg pointed in. So that is external rotation. Think of if you're walking backwards and you're doing like a hurdle. like stepping over a hurdle backwards, that is external rotation. Next is hip internal rotation, which is what I like to refer to as the I need to pee stance. Your hips are tilted inwards, so your thighs are pointed inwards, your legs are pointed outwards. It kind of looks like you need to go to the bathroom. That is hip internal rotation. So your hip is rotated inward and your leg rotates outward. Here's the midline. You can see the thighs pointed inward, the legs are pointing outward. Now we concluded the hips. Now we're going to get to the knee. The knee has two functions, which is to flex and extend. So starting off with flexion, this is kind of what it looks like in this picture. We have our baseline guy here, and then we have him kind of doing a knee flexion motion. He's also in hip flexion because you kind of see that hips raised, right? It's pointing forward, so it's being flexed. But the knee is also being flexed here too. So here's your anatomical midline, and then you can kind of see, I drew arrows to kind of indicate the motion as what happens here. Your ankle is being brought back, and your knee is kind of moving forward, like your shin almost is being pushed back, ankle being pushed back, right? Your knee is being flexed. Your knee's not straight, it's bent, therefore it's flexed. Okay, so if your knee is bent, your knee is flexed, you see that flex right there. So knee flexion. Then we have knee extension, which is your knee is straight. So here's your baseline guy again. He would be a knee knee extension right here. In this picture, he has hip flexion going on because his hip is raised, right? His hip is pointing forward, but his leg is straight, therefore it has a knee extension. Same kind of concept with the midline going down. You can kind of see the arrows, right? From the back, your leg is straightening out. You're pushing your ankle up, which forces your leg to be straight and your knee to be straight. Your knee, right? Your shin is coming up, forces the knee straight. So knee extension is straight. Knee flexion is bent. Now we're going to get into the ankles. Ankle dorsiflexion is toes pointed up. So here's your baseline guy, right? Baseline feet. Toes are pointed neutral here. They're pointed up. Anatomical midline, you see the toes pointed up. So when you lift your toes up, that's ankle dorsiflexion. Ankle plantarflexion is when your toes are pointed downwards. You can see the baseline kind of neutral foot here. Your toes are pointed downwards, so it's plantarflexion. Here's the midline, right? Your toes, this is a normal. This is toes pointed down. Toes pointed down is plantarflexion. Toes pointed up is dorsiflexion. The other two actions you can do is an ankle inversion and eversion. So when you sit cross-legged, your ankles are inverted. I don't know why that says ankles. Let me fix that real quick. Your ankles. I don't know why I had that, but yeah, so your ankles are inverted. So you have your baseline here. Imagine, so this is kind of like you're sitting crisscross applesauce, right? You're sitting cross-legged. You're in an external rotation. Your knees are flexed inward, and then your ankles are kind of tilted inward, right? If you can kind of imagine external rotation, right? Hips are out, knees are being flexed, they're kind of coming in, your leg is, and then you have your ankles kind of like your pinky toe side is on the ground of your foot. That's ankle inversion, when you're tilting your ankle inward. So aka sitting cross-legged. Ankle eversion is the opposite, when you're sitting in the W position. So this isn't the best drawing, but I tried to kind of demonstrate it for you. So you have your hips in an internal rotation, right? Your hips are coming inward, your legs are going outward, pointed out, but then as a result, your ankles are tilted outwards. So if you sit in a W stance, that is ankle eversion, because your ankles are pointed outward. That's when your big toe side of your foot is on the ground. So inversion, tilting your ankle inward, pinky toe part is on the ground. Eversion, tilted outwards, big toe part is on the ground. Now let's have some practice questions to help you review this information that you just learned. So what position is the hip and the knee in? Feel free to pause the video at any time if you need some more time, but let's look at our options. So we have hip flexion and knee extension, hip flexion and knee flexion, hip extension and knee extension, or hip extension and knee flexion. So when we look at this drawing, we have our anatomical midline here. So let's see here, right? Our hip would be around here. Is our hip going straight down? No, it's pointed out, right? It's coming out. Remember when we're going to kick that soccer ball, this is as you've already making the follow through of the kick. So it's in the flexion. So we have hip flexion going on. Our knee, is it going straight out like this? Nope. Our knee is bent. So our knee is flexed. So we have a hip flexion and a knee flexion. So our answer would be right there, B, hip flexion and knee flexion. So next question is, what position is the hip and the knee in? So here I tried to highlight the knee, ignore the not so good drawings, but yeah. So here's your midline. You see the hip is going down, right? It's extended because the hip is pointing straight down. Your thighs are pointing straight down, so it's extension. And then you see your knee is cocked back, right? Your knee is bent, so your knee is in flexion. So we would have a hip extension and a knee flexion here. So D. Next question is, what position is the hip and knee and ankle in? So hip external rotation, knee extension, ankle dorsiflexion. Hip internal rotation, knee flexion, ankle dorsiflexion. Hip internal rotation, knee extension, ankle plantar flexion. Or hip external rotation, knee flexion, and ankle plantar flexion. So here you kind of see the hips, right? We see our hips being out, our hips go out, and our knee and our leg go in. So your thighs are out, pointed outwards. Your leg is pointed inward. So when your thighs point out, your leg point in, that means it's an external rotation, right? You can picture the hips. The hips are going out. The hips are externally rotated. So if they're externally rotated in this position, we see the knee is bent. So it's a knee flexion. So external rotation, knee flexion. And then we can figure which one are these ankles look like. Based on the midline, we see that the feet, I'm trying to indicate that the feet are pointed down. So if the feet are pointed down, it would be plantar flexion. So here it's kind of like, imagine you're standing on your tiptoes and then your knees are bent. This is kind of the position that you would be if you're standing on the sides, like your sides of your feet, both legs spread apart, knees bent on your tiptoes. This is the position you would be. So it would be hip external rotation, knee flexion, and ankle plantar flexion, which is D, hip external rotation, knee flexion, ankle plantar flexion. Now the last question, challenge question. Jim is sitting cross-legged or crisscross. His hips are externally rotated and his knees are bent in flexion. Would the ankles be inverted or everted? Right, so now let's think about that. He's sitting crisscross. Does that look familiar from a different one? Kind of like this, right? He's sitting crisscross. So kind of picture this in your mind. He's sitting crisscross, so his hips are externally rotated, his knees are bent in flexion. Would the ankles be inverted or everted? The ankles would be inverted. And I kind of tried to draw this for you. It's not the best drawing, but you can kind of see. Right, so his hips are externally rotated, his knees are bent inwards because they're flexed. And then when you're sitting cross-legged, the pinky side of your foot is what's touching the ground. So then you would be inverted because your ankles are internally, like they're kind of like inverted. They're internally tilted. So the correct answer would be inverted. If this helped, please let me know. Any support is appreciated. And hopefully you learned the movements of your lower extremity. Thanks for watching.